There was a time when Castlevania was on top of the world. Every release received positive reception, built a strong fan base since the first game, and was one of Konami's pillar franchises. As of this video, it's been 10 years since we've gotten an original Castlevania game. Nowadays, Castlevania is relegated to spin-offs, supplementary material, and crossovers. But there was a time when it was one of the most recognizable action platformers. Its gothic aesthetic, coupled with a story about a family of vampire hunters locked in an eternal battle against Count Dracula, and the forces of evil throughout different eras. To go over my own history with Castlevania, I've always had an interest in this series since I was young. Back in the early days of YouTube, anyone who watched content focused on classic video games of course watched The Angry Video Game Nerd. And to anyone who knows their classic YouTube lore, you know that Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest was his first video. Besides that, my other experience with Castlevania came in the form of emulators. I was young, so anytime I attempted to play a Castlevania game, I couldn't get past the first stage. So technically speaking, this video marks the first time I've beaten a Castlevania game. For the record, all the games I'll be playing for this retrospective will be through the Castlevania Anniversary Collection on Steam. Besides having the 4 games I'll be covering, it comes with a save feature, which is really convenient when dealing with the more annoying stages. Given the utter disregard Konami shows Castlevania these days, I think videos like these give Castlevania much needed attention, because we all know Konami's not going to do it. Plus, it's fitting the first Castlevania game I play is the first one. So without further ado, let's begin Castlevania. To begin talking about the origins of Castlevania, like many franchises that emerged from Japan in the 1980s, Castlevania traces its roots to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Konami, who began their forte into video games with arcade systems in the early 80s, witnessed the rise in popularity of home consoles. As a result, Konami shifted their strategy to developing games for the NES. However, the NES wouldn't be the only platform they developed games for. You see, Konami would also develop games for the MSX2, a home computer part of the still fresh PC market. But the reason I bring this up is because there exist 2 specific versions of Castlevania 1 relevant to this video. There's the NES original released first in Japan for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, and the MSX2 version releasing a month later. You think that'd be the end of it, but in fact, there are distinct differences between both versions. Let's get the obvious one out of the way. But Castlevania is called Vampire Killer, in reference to the whip the Belmonts used to defeat Dracula. As for gameplay, here's where the differences rear their head. For one thing, Vampire Killer, given the limitations of the MSX, uses screen transitions instead of scrolling in the NES version, which got really annoying really quickly when doing research for this part of the video. Imagine playing Super Mario Bros. And this exact structure was used. I guarantee you most people wouldn't make it past World 1. But to at least give a compliment to Vampire Killer, the game is very non-linear, having you find keys scattered throughout the level to progress forward. It's almost like foreshadowing, given that Castlevania would later become a Metroidvania. I still think you should play the NES version, but if you're curious, Vampire Killer might be worth checking out. Though it was only released in Japan and Europe, so your best bet is to use an emulator. But you didn't hear that from me. Finally, there's Castlevania Chronicles, a remake developed for the PS1. It updates a lot of the usual things you expect a remake to do. Updates the graphics, rebalances the gameplay, and remixes the soundtrack. However, when you boot up Chronicles, it gives you the choice of playing either a port of the original or the remake. Funnily enough, the port I just mentioned is another version of Castlevania 1, released on the X68K computer in 1993. But I'll stop right there. Chronicles looks like a cool remake, and it accomplished what it set out to do. But its greatest accomplishment was giving us Simon's badass Red Barbarian design. As you can tell, Castlevania 1 has been re-released countless times, and I just wanted to hit my bases regarding the most prominent versions of the game. When a game is re-released multiple times, it naturally creates a debate as to which version you should play. I think many people agree and say the NES version is the best version, and the one the developers poured the most effort into. That's not to discredit the other versions. I'll give 80s Konami credit. They saw the potential of early PC gaming. As for Chronicles, I'd consider it to be the exception to the rule because this version was probably someone's first experience with Castlevania 1. And remember, it was released on the same console as Symphony of the Night. Either way, play the best version, but if you can't, go with what's convenient to you. As for the origins of Castlevania itself, Castlevania dates its creator to Hideyoshi Akamatsu. I'll admit, when looking into his background, there wasn't a lot of information available about him. What little we do know is that before Castlevania 1, Akamatsu was involved in the development of Konami's arcade games in the early 80s. And in his personal life, he was a huge cinema fan, which played a large role in his projects. In interviews, Akamatsu described Castlevania as being made by people who always wanted to do something cinematic, and that translated into the visuals and music. The title screen has a film aesthetic, the credits being parodies of famous actors like Christopher B., Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff's, and of course having Count Dracula be the series' main antagonist. By that description, Castlevania, when you really think about it, is a giant love letter to classic cinema. What's interesting is that in Japan, Castlevania is actually known as Dracula's Satanic Castle, so during the localization, not wanting to offend religious people, and Nintendo of America's strict policies, many of their religious symbols, as well as blood and gore, were removed or toned down. The name Castlevania is credited to the Konami of America's senior vice president, Emil Heidkamp, and once that issue was solved, Castlevania would release in North America in March 1987, coinciding with the 90th anniversary of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. Even though Akamatsu is widely regarded as the creator and given the most credit, there's a lot of uncertainty as to who actually created the series. That's mainly because Akamatsu himself is a very mysterious figure. We know he worked on the first 3 games, and after that, the man just disappeared from the video game industry. The easiest explanation is that he left under unknown circumstances, but my headcanon is that after he left, he watched the sunrise as Konami slowly but surely destroyed his creation over time. At the very least, I'd argue that Akamatsu managed to deliver on his vision, and if that's the case, how did Castlevania live up to its inspirations? Well, in all honesty, Castlevania begins like a classic horror movie. In 1691, 100 years after the defeat of Count Dracula, the people of Transylvania enjoyed a century of peace. On Easter Sunday, as the people were celebrating the resurrection, a legend says that every 100 years when mankind turns its back against God, the forces of darkness will rise again seeking to sow chaos and destruction. As the festivities continue, the followers of the Count gather in a monastery and perform a dark ritual, resurrecting their former master. Now revived, the Count's old castle, believed to have been destroyed 100 years prior, resurrects itself over Transylvania, threatening the world once again. Simon Belmont, descendant of a legendary line of vampire hunters, grabs his family's weapon, the vampire killer, a sacred whip able to defeat Dracula, and heads to the castle to battle the Count for the fate of the world. That's the setup for Castlevania 1. Typical for NES games, the plot and characters are simple, meant to segue players into the gameplay. Like all first installments, Castlevania 1 would establish all the elements seen in future games. Already, you can see a lot of common horror tropes with Castlevania's plot, such as the prevalence of Christianity and the occult. As for the game's protagonist, Simon Belmont, Simon is a descendant of a line of vampire hunters, who have sworn to battle Dracula as long as he exists as an existential threat. For you see, most Castlevania games star a different Belmont set in a different period in history. To be honest, that premise is what sparked my initial interest in Castlevania. It's about a family stuck in a never-ending battle against the forces of evil. And yes, I could make the obvious JoJo reference, but it writes itself. Simon Belmont is easily the most recognizable Belmont, since after all, he's the first one we're introduced to. Continuing with the film inspiration, Simon's design is based off of Arnold Schwarzenegger's portrayal of Conan the Barbarian, and I do like his original design. It's the version of Simon that constantly appears in key art, and whenever Simon makes an appearance in other games. However, I won't lie and say that I think his Red Barbarian design is probably my favorite version of Simon, and that's thanks to the incredible artwork of Ayami Kojima, able to capture and enhance the gothic aesthetic of Castlevania. And then there's this design where Simon looks like a male stripper. Meanwhile, the inspiration behind the vampire killer is pretty straightforward, being inspired by Indiana Jones. And finally, the Japanese pronunciation of Belmont is Belmondo, meant as a reference to Jean-Paul Belmondo, a famous French actor who was especially popular in Japan in the 80s. Every franchise is defined by the first character you meet, and I'm glad to say Simon Belmont makes a strong first impression. Once you press start, Castlevania begins with Simon approaching the gates of Dracula's castle, as the music and atmosphere set the mood. NES games always did a fantastic job of throwing you instantly into the game without taking this time to set up the story, because that's what the manual's for. On your walk up to the front gate, Castlevania 1 will drop free whip upgrades and a secondary weapon. Once inside, here's where Castlevania 1 truly begins. Let's get the basics out of the way. There are a total of 6 areas, each of which contain 3 stages with a boss waiting at the end. Yeah, Castlevania is not a very long game. If you're good and avoid getting game overs, you can beat Castlevania 1 in less than an hour. Each area of Dracula's castle contains its own unique challenges that the player will have to overcome, and the closer you get to Dracula, the harder the enemies and level design will reflect that. What makes Castlevania unique compared to other platformers coming out at the time was that rather than design levels with flat terrain, Castlevania's levels offer a lot of verticality in their design. There will be instances when levels will present stairs to the player as a means of progression, creating variety in the level design without ever being repetitive. The castle's entrance does a fantastic job teaching you the basic mechanics of the game. Some of the enemies like the dogs might give you trouble on a first run, since they patiently wait for you to get close and pounce on you. But once you get to the second stage, the scene changes, having you go underground, platforming over a flooded room emerging on the other side. Kudos to Castlevania for having seamless transition between stages. Once you pass through the door, you're on to the next area. It's a great way of keeping the action moving without stopping. Then there's the clock tower, which rather than being designed as flat and linear, has Simon ascend a long tower to reach the other side. You'll know you're at the end of an area when you see a door at the end of the screen. Those are meant to act as checkpoints. That way if you lose a life, you'll restart at the beginning of the area. Once you reach the boss, you'll have to whip it to death enough times to grab the orb it drops, completing the stage. Bosses in Castlevania can range from total pushovers or some of the hardest bosses you'll ever face. Obviously, early game bosses aren't very hard because their patterns are easy to remember. That applies to late game bosses, who can be really difficult if it's your first time or are unprepared. What I mean by unprepared is that if you don't have the holy water, certain bosses become infinitely more difficult. Castlevania does have that classic NES jank, and it's most prevalent with Simon himself. To describe how a Castlevania game plays, Castlevania is like a platformer with a mix of RPG mechanics to make it stand out amongst its contemporaries at the time. You control Simon moving left or right on the D-pad and use the A button to jump and the B button to swing his whip. Pretty basic given that we're on the NES. However, don't expect you'll be playing a standard platformer from the time, because Castlevania has its own quirks, for good or bad. To start, see that walk? Besides being the pinnacle of manliness, Simon is unable to sprint at all, only being able to strut at the game's pace, probably so he can assert his dominance over Dracula and his minions. Joking aside, Simon at the base of a set of stairs can press up on the D-pad to walk up them. Now, stairs in classic Castlevania have kind of a bad reputation. When you walk up a set of stairs, the only way to get off them is to go back where you started, or to the top of the flight, because unfortunately, Simon isn't able to jump off full on them. You can still attack, but that's relegated to where he's facing. So when you commence the animation, you better make sure all the enemies are defeated, because otherwise, you're going to have to take all that damage coming your way. You can't be knocked off, but it's like putting a cherry on a turd. It's still a turd at the end of the day. Simon's controls, to give a comparison, are very similar to how early arcade games were controlled, and given Akamatsu worked on some of them, it makes sense in retrospect. But here's where the problems start. You see, when Simon jumps, you're unable to control his jump while in midair. So in other words, once you press that jump button, you better make sure your timing's on point, because you're at the point of no return. There were plenty of instances of me jumping and instinctively trying to control Simon in midair, and I won't lie, that was something I had to get used to very quickly. When you fall down a bottomless pit, Simon drops like a rock. It reminds me a lot of Mega Man 1, which had the exact same thing happen. It does make platforming almost ball-clenching to say the least. However, what Castlevania is most notorious for is Simon's knockback when taking damage. This right here can be downright rage-inducing, because in the later stages, Castlevania is very unforgiving when it comes to enemy placement over bottomless pits. If you do end up in that scenario, do yourself a favor and accept your fate. What makes Simon unique compared to a lot of other protagonists at the time was his method of attack. You'd think a guy like Simon would use a sword or weapon made from silver, but instead he uses a whip. By pressing the B button, Simon uses his whip to attack enemies. At the beginning of the game, the vampire killer is a dinky little whip that deals low damage and has piss poor range. However, by destroying candles, sometimes they'll drop a whip upgrade. The first will upgrade the whip's attack, and the second upgrades its range. If you lose a life, the vampire killer will reset to its base form. However, Castlevania makes it very easy to upgrade it back to full. Like I'm talking about instantly upon respawning. Simon can only use his whip in the direction he's facing, but he can use it while jumping and crouching. According to Akamatsu, there were intentions to have the whip be multi-directional, but technical limitations put a halt to that. The challenge comes from being able to time your whip attacks to hit the enemy once they're within range, and thankfully the vampire killer's hitbox is very forgiving. One thing I noticed during my playthroughs was that if an enemy hits you at the same time you hit him, you'll do 5 times the damage than normally. I don't know if this was intentional on the developer's part, but it was great during boss fights, despite the trade-off. Of course, the vampire killer isn't the only weapon at Simon's disposal. Simon can pick up a multitude of weapons dropped from enemies or candles to give him other means of attacking enemies. Each weapon has its own usefulness, and I won't lie, some items are better than others. All of them use hearts as a method of ammo, and every time you use an item by pressing up and B, it'll consume 1 heart. The only exception to the rule is the stopwatch, which will consume 5 hearts. But finding hearts is done the same way you get items, so you'll always have a steady reserve. Hidden in certain stages, you'll find numbered pickups that increase the number of weapons you can use at a given time. However, if you pick up another weapon, it'll reset to level 1. Nothing is worse than having a fully upgraded holy water to then accidentally picking up the axe, so be careful in what candles you destroy. There are of course other minor items like the rosemary, which is a screen nuke, and the invincibility potion that makes you invincible for a brief period of time. Now, to be honest, there's a clear hierarchy in regards to which items are better than the other. The dagger and throwing axe completely suck. The dagger doesn't deal enough damage, it quickly wears out its usefulness. And meanwhile with the axe, you have to consider your positioning judging by the way Simon throws it. Then there's the stopwatch, which is pretty good in certain situations, allowing you to deal a lot of damage or avoid enemies. The boomerang's pretty good, especially when you have the level 3 upgrade, but nothing comes close to the holy water. When you get this item, hold on to it and never get another item. The holy water makes quick work of every enemy and boss this game offers. It can stun enemies, making them vulnerable, its after effect deals damage, and it's cheap to use. As long as you keep throwing holy water and mix in whip attacks, bosses are completely mute due to all the points I just made. By all means, you can fight them legitimately, but I can't imagine any scenario where you'd want to fight death without the holy water, because fighting him legitimately is like... Really, Simon's controls are very basic, if dated to say the least. It's something you have to accept when playing a game that's 38 years old as of the making of this video. To at least end this section of the video on a positive note, I think Castlevania 1 is a game that rewards skill over being unnecessarily hard. You see, a common thing you hear about the first 3 Castlevania games is that they're hard, especially to new players. On my first playthrough, which was done off screen, I easily felt the difficulty creep in more and more as I got further into the game. At the very least, Castlevania has infinite continues, so even when I got a game over, I immediately picked up from the beginning of the area. One of the ways Castlevania 1 balances its difficulties by scaling the damage enemies can inflict on Simon. In the first couple areas, enemies can do about 2 bars of damage, but once you get to the final area, Simon can only take 4 hits, roughly translating to 4 bars of health. On a first playthrough, this can definitely be a rude awakening once Castlevania starts filling levels with its more annoying enemies. I definitely became better at the game because by that point, I understood the enemy positions and where secret wall chickens were located. However, that doesn't mean enemies were more forgiving. Stage 2 introduces one of the most annoying enemies in probably all of gaming, the Medusa heads. How these guys work is that they'll fly towards Simon in a wave-like pattern with the intent to ram into him. Worst of all, Medusa heads love to appear when you're over a bottomless pit, so you have to watch their movement carefully to avoid being knocked back. I'm not ashamed to admit I lost multiple lives to Medusa heads, but I did better on repeated playthroughs. Every time they appeared on screen, I won't lie and say I had a few close calls. I remember on my first playthrough, I initially struggled with stage 5 because dealing with armor knights while trying to avoid the Medusa heads was not fun, especially when by this point in the game, enemies do a ton of damage, and it only got worse once I reached the hallway of death. This area is full of enemies that want nothing but to stop you under any means necessary. Worst of all is, this is the final stress to probably the hardest boss in the game. A good tip is to make sure you have the holy water, which you can get in the beginning of the stage, and throw it where the knights stand. That way the holy water's after effect will damage the knights and Medusa heads. Difficulty in classic NES games is something I expect when playing games with the reputation of Castlevania. However, Castlevania 1 is what I would consider a good kind of hard, because in a time where video game rentals were common, games like Castlevania 1 had to be hard to get the most out of the player. Even if you managed to beat it without any trouble, you could quickly return it. That doesn't apply nowadays, but my point stands. Castlevania 1 is a game that rewards you for being good at the game. Every time I screwed up, I felt like it was my fault because I didn't pay attention to an enemy or I was reckless. Castlevania 1 really plays like an old-school arcade game in terms of its controls, level design, and length, all of which combine to make it a very accessible game once you learn the mechanics. However, that's only half the battle because Castlevania 1 has an incredible atmosphere and soundtrack even to this day. Castlevania 1 is essentially a classic horror movie in the form of a video game. The atmosphere of Dracula's castle takes on an amalgamation of different designs, and it's explained in later games that the castle is an entity of its own, able to take on any appearance. Area 3 is my favorite area in Dracula's castle because after you ascend the tower, you arrive at an outdoors area overlooking the night sky. It's great visual storytelling, and I liked how you could see Dracula's tower before the boss room. The next area also repeats the same idea. On the map, it shows the level being set underground, and lo and behold, it begins with a cutscene of Simon falling into a pit, with the level being set in the caves underneath the castle. Atmosphere is one thing, but music is just as important in enhancing the game. Castlevania's soundtrack was composed by Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoshi Terashima, and the reason I waited to mention these two up until now is because their contributions deserve their own section of the video. For Yamashita, it would not only be her first composing experience, but her only contribution to the Castlevania series, which is kind of a shame, but at least she left a strong first impression. And as for Terashima, she'd returned for Castlevania 2. With only 9 songs composed, these two understood the assignment because not only is Castlevania 1's soundtrack catchy, but adds to the horror inspiration seen in game. One of the most iconic songs in Castlevania Vampire Killer is an excellent first song getting you ready to make your way to Dracula's castle. Wicked Child, which sounds like an 80s rock song. In fact, all the stage names sound like rock songs. Vampire Killer, Heart of Fire, Nothing to Lose, Black Knight. Really, the entire soundtrack is great to listen to. And I think Castlevania 1's soundtrack is why it's remembered as a cult classic. The last thing I want to talk about before facing Dracula is to go over the movies and references Castlevania proudly wears on its sleeve. Throughout the years, there's been multiple incarnations of the Dracula story. For Castlevania, it takes the most inspiration from 1958's Horror of Dracula, because the director Terence Fisher and actor Christopher Lee are referenced in the credits, Lee in fact being the actor who played the role of the Count. However, the original 1931 Dracula film is also referenced in the form of the setting being Transylvania. And of course, all of this wouldn't be possible without Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, and finally the Count being inspired by Vlad the Impaler. Then there are the other references, which I'll do in a lightning round, including Medusa, Frankenstein's monster, and Igor, the Mummy, Death, aka the Grim Reaper, and finally all the actors in the credits. It's kind of a smart idea to use pre-existing horror characters rather than creating new ones, because it works for a game like Castlevania, which is making these references intentionally and grounds the universe in our world, all culminating with the final battle with Dracula. Area 6 begins with a bridge connecting to the clock tower. In this stage, the bat from Area 1 has been demoted to a regular enemy. Your best bet is to ignore them and use the stopwatch to freeze this specific bat, so that way you can skip past him and enter the clock tower. The clock tower can be a very tricky area if you're unprepared or reckless. Here you'll face skeleton enemies that throw bones, and the trick is to bait them to get closer and finish them with one hit. Once you enter the center room of the clock tower, you can grab a wall chicken in the corner, but you have to watch out for the birds dropping imps, because they could swarm you and knock you into a bottomless pit. But once you head downstairs, be patient with some of the enemies, and take any damage you take on stairs. Then it's smooth sailing to Dracula. Exiting the clock tower, you walk up the stairs where Dracula is waiting for you. Entering his chamber, the count rises and the final boss begins. If you know the strategy against Dracula, his first phase can be beaten very easily. His only weak point is his head, so you have to jump up in order to reach him. However, when he spawns in, he'll open his cape and throw fireballs at you. How his fireballs work is that if you're standing when he opens his cape, his fireballs will shoot ground level, and if you're in midair when he opens his cape, his fireballs will shoot high. Meaning the most effective strategy when doing damage is to wait for Dracula to open his cape while you're on the ground, then jump once his cape opens, and then go for the head. One annoying gimmick he likes to do is throughout the fight, Dracula will teleport around the room, and sometimes he'll teleport right on top of you. When Dracula teleports, always make sure you're moving and never stop for whatever reason, because at this point in the game, Simon will go down in 4 hits. Thankfully, if you do get a game over, you'll restart at the bottom of the tower. A nice act of mercy from the developers. Once you defeat his first form, Dracula enters his second phase, transforming into his Bat Demon form. To be honest, I think his second phase is easier because in the leftmost candle there's a holy water inside, and you know what comes next. You use the holy water to stun Dracula and mix in whip attacks to his head. Eventually Dracula is defeated and Castlevania crumbles as the credits roll. However, during the fight, the Count managed to injure Simon, and as the sun rises on a new day, a strange feeling plagues Simon. Castlevania 1, like all first entries, set the standard for the rest of the series, and is remembered as one of the NES's best games. Like I said in the beginning, Castlevania 1 was my first time beating a Castlevania game. Unlike other games I covered where I had previous experience with them, when I recorded gameplay for this video, I felt the need to do multiple playthroughs because I wanted to understand how a Castlevania game works. Thankfully, Castlevania 1 was a very fun, short game that I felt was a good first exposure. Naturally, when starting a new series, there's always a debate as to where to properly begin. The most convenient answer is to start at the latest release on current hardware, except in the case of Castlevania, it's been 10 years since an original installment. If that's the case, then realistically, your best bet is to begin where it all began, or play an entry that piques your interest the most. I hope the further I get into Castlevania, I don't feel a sense of apathy over the current state of the series, so fingers crossed. Before I go, I'll also mention that when you beat the game for the first time, the game will begin the second quest, which, as you should know, is a harder version of the first quest. With that being said, the next time I revisit Castlevania, it'll be Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. I've heard mixed opinions about this game, so I'm looking forward to seeing what the deal is. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care.